In this video, we will go over some important aspects of reading comprehension in a very introductory approach to draw some important distinctions. So first of all, comprehension means understanding. So reading comprehension means understanding what you read. We have already considered what it means to understand and what processes have to be involved in producing this understanding. In this video, we will briefly go over what determines how well you understand, what needs to develop for reading comprehension to develop properly, some ways in which we can measure how much one understands what they read. We will talk a little bit about some important predictors of understanding and what kinds of problems might underlie problems with understanding. So what determines how well you understand? Well, obviously, first of all, in order to understand something that you read, you have to be able to recognize the words that you're reading. So reading accuracy is very important in order to be able to understand anything. Once you recognize the words, you need to know the meanings of the words. So having a good vocabulary is important for being able to understand what you read. Also, you have to be able to combine the meanings of the words in the syntactically appropriate way to make sense of the meanings of sentences. So syntactic knowledge is necessary. And you have to be able to combine the meanings of sentences so that you can make sense of the whole passage, which involves the ability to process discourse. To make sense of things, either while connecting two sentences or while integrating sentences throughout the text and with your background knowledge, you need to be able to make the right inferences. So inferencing ability is very important for understanding. And then in order to integrate with general knowledge in the appropriate way, you need to have the appropriate kind of general knowledge. So having a lot of background knowledge is important for being able to understand. You also need to be able to monitor your own understanding. Metacognitive ability is important for understanding because you need to be able to monitor the coherence of the text, that is the coherence of the model that you're building, so that you know when it needs to be revised or started over when things aren't coherent. Of these things, only the first one is reading specific. So the ability to figure out which words are written is a reading skill. These aspects of understanding are also involved in understanding spoken language, and so they are part of your language skills. And these parts are related to your general cognitive ability, which has to do with knowing things about the world and using them to make sense of the world itself, and knowing when that is the case. So in relating those to our diagram of processes and representations, we can remember the two levels of processing that we've talked about. There is word level processing, which has to do with word reading. And then there is text level processing, which has to do with comprehension. And in this regard, we should also remember that there are different kinds of difficulties associated with different regions in this diagram. So any problems here would be language problems. Here there would be speech problems. These are intellectual problems, and only these would be reading problems, which means if you want to reach an understanding here, of course you need to go through reading. So a reading problem will limit your understanding, but the understanding itself, which takes place here, will be limited by language and cognitive difficulties rather than frank reading problems. To develop good reading comprehension skills, of course, first of all, you need to learn to read words. But you also need to have well-developed spoken language, including knowledge of words, knowledge of syntax, and knowledge of discourse. and this helps you understand both things you read and things you're told. And you also need cognitive development, which includes inferencing skill development, build-up of background knowledge, and development of metacognition, the ability to monitor yourself. So development of strong reading comprehension actually builds on these three axes: development of word reading, development of language skills, and development of more general cognitive skills. How can we measure understanding? There are actually several different ways that look at different aspects of comprehension. One possible way is functional measurement. For example, it's to measure the ability to follow instructions. You can give simple or increasingly complex instructions, and you can see up to which point someone can follow them accurately. This method is most often used in measuring spoken comprehension or language comprehension rather than reading comprehension. A common way of assessing comprehension is to probe the internal model. That is, let someone read a passage and then ask them specific questions about it in order to figure out what their internal situation model is composed of, if it is complete, rich, and accurate. So you can ask open-ended questions or multiple choice questions to someone after they read a passage. And the questions can be made such that they probe whether they remember specific pieces of information, whether they can integrate the meaning of sentences across the text, whether they produce appropriate local inferences that are required for interpreting single sentences or joining adjacent sentences, or whether they can make the right inferences that produce coherence across the entire passage. Another common way of assessing comprehension is what is called a cloze test, which involves replacing some of the words in a passage with gaps and asking someone to fill in the gaps. And these can be completely open, or you can offer a multiple choice for each gap. Finally, there is also the option to ask someone to retell a story. Successful retelling depends on not only having constructed an appropriate situation model, but also on the ability to use it in order to express it appropriately in building your own narrative. Obviously, these different kinds of tests have different task requirements and depend on different understanding processes to different degrees. What are the predictors of understanding? Well, when we say predictors, what we mean is what other things that we can measure are associated with someone's reading comprehension ability. And they can be concurrent or longitudinal. A concurrent predictor is something else we can measure at the same time that we measure understanding, so on the same day or in the same session, that is related to their understanding. A longitudinal predictor is something that we can measure in advance in order to predict what their comprehension will be later. So for example, for a concurrent predictor, we might want to measure someone's current vocabulary and see if that predicts how well they understand. For a longitudinal predictor, we might ask, what can we measure in preschool children that will predict how well they will understand written passages in middle elementary school? So these are two different kinds of questions. Importantly, the predictors of understanding are different across development. So it's not the exact same things that predict how well you understand in different ages or in different developmental levels of reading and language. In the early stages of reading comprehension, when you first learn to read, your understanding is mostly limited by and dependent on how well you read the words. So there is early dependence of reading comprehension on word reading, very strong dependence. As children become better readers and generally can accurately decode most words, reading comprehension becomes less dependent on the ability to decode the words and more reliant on language skills. That's because you can already decode most words, so that's no longer the limiting factor. And the other language skills that are involved in the actual understandings gradually take over as important predictors. Listening comprehension is a main predictor once word reading has settled. Listening comprehension is your ability to understand spoken information. Morphological awareness is also an important predictor. Morphological awareness is the conscious understanding of word structure, how words are formed, and how word parts are related to word meanings. General cognitive ability, both verbal and nonverbal, is a strong predictor of understanding. And at a slightly more specific level, in particular, vocabulary and working memory are related to understanding or the reading comprehension ability. Let us look at these last two in a bit more detail to understand what they are. What is working memory? Working memory is a concept from cognitive psychology that refers to active short-term memory. Short-term because we're talking about things you can remember for a short period of time, and active because working memory also includes the idea that you're processing this information and not just retaining it. So there is both a processing requirement and a retention requirement. And that's how it's measured, with tests that make both demands simultaneously. Tests that require you to both retain something in memory and process it actively at the same time. These tests were originally developed to account for how different kinds of materials are retained and how their properties affect their retention. Working memory is generally thought to be necessary for syntactic processing because to process the syntax, you need to both remember the words in a sentence and process their meanings depending on their relations to one another. Also, working memory is thought to be very important for comprehension because in order to integrate sentence meanings across the text, you need to be remembering the sentences, the meaning of the sentences, while you process them so that they're integrated. Here is an example of a commonly used working memory test for children. This is actually a very demanding test. In this test, the processing requirement is for the child to say whether each sentence is true or false. And the retention requirement is to remember and then recall the last word in the sentence. So the examiner reads one sentence aloud to the child, and the child has to say true or false. And afterwards, the child has to say the last word in the sentence. And you do this with a number of sentences. And if this is a level that the child can master, then you move on to the next one where you have pairs of sentences. And the difficulty here is greatly increased because the child has to remember the last words until the end. So the examiner first says this sentence, the child says true or false. Then the examiner says this sentence, the child says true or false, and then the child has to recall the last words in the right order. So the child must remember this word and retain it in memory until this sentence has been responded to. And for someone who can respond at this level, then you go on to triplets, so 3 sentences at a time and upwards. And this becomes very difficult and requires a lot of concentration. What about vocabulary? Vocabulary turns out to be the strongest concurrent and longitudinal predictor of reading comprehension. So among relatively specific things you can measure in order to predict reading comprehension, or among things that you can search for associates to reading comprehension, vocabulary measures are the strongest ones. There are different aspects of vocabulary that can be important. Vocabulary breadth refers to how many words you know. Vocabulary depth refers to how well you know them. to what level of richness you represent their meanings. Expressive vocabulary is the words you can use when you speak, and receptive vocabulary is the words you can understand when they're spoken to you. The connection between vocabulary and comprehension is the object of ongoing research, and there are a number of researchers who are trying to figure it out, and it's obviously quite complicated. Obviously, you need to know the words in a text in order to understand it. But vocabulary tests do not need to have the same kinds of words as the text that you're reading in order to predict how well you will understand. So it's not a matter of knowing the specific words, but rather a matter of knowing lots of words. So some people believe that vocabulary tests are so closely associated to comprehension because they can be used as indexes of general language development. So when you measure somebody's vocabulary, what you're indirectly measuring is their overall language skills, because someone with strong language skills will normally have greater language experience and will have developed a larger and deeper vocabulary. Vocabulary tests can also be proxies for other important aspects of reading comprehension, such as general knowledge or general verbal ability. That's because if you have a lot of experience, then you have a lot of general knowledge, and you also know a lot of words as a result of that same experience. So a vocabulary measure cannot separate these things. Or vocabulary may function as a measure of your general verbal ability, again in the same kind of logic as for language development. These things don't need to be exclusive, so they can all be relevant to some extent. So the connection between vocabulary and reading comprehension may not be very specific, but very extensive, and that may be why vocabulary is very strongly related to reading comprehension. It should also be pointed out that the relationship between vocabulary and reading comprehension is not unidirectional. That is, it's not just that knowing more words leads you to understand better. It is also that if you understand better, you are likely to learn more words from the text that you read. Because after some beginner stages, you probably read in order to learn. So if you understand more, you learn more, including learning more words. Finally, there are measurement issues that may affect the strength of the relationship between vocabulary and comprehension. Vocabulary tests tend to be very reliable, and that may be part of the reason why they're reliably associated with comprehension compared to other kinds of tests that cannot be measured so reliably. Let us look at a couple of examples of vocabulary tests. In one very commonly used vocabulary test, a receptive vocabulary test, the child is presented with a set of pictures like this one, and then the examiner speaks a word. The word is not written like I have done here in the example. The examiner says the word, the child only hears the word and has to select the correct picture. And there are many pictures ranging in levels of difficulty according to the ages being tested. In a very different kind of vocabulary test, the examiner asks the child for definitions. So for example, you can ask, what is a hat? Or what is a knife? And these are obviously for younger children because they concern concrete objects. And in this kind of text, answers are given 0, 1, or 2 points, depending on when they are very generic, in which case they don't get any points. They are somewhat incomplete or vague, in which case they get 1 point, or they're complete or a synonym, in which case they get 2 points, showing that the child really understands the extent of the meaning of this particular word. And this is therefore a test of vocabulary depth. When there are problems with reading comprehension, where can they come from? Following the list of aspects discussed previously, the first possible source is problems with word recognition. So only for beginner readers, if someone doesn't yet recognize the words in the text, they will obviously have difficulties understanding the text. Most commonly, comprehension problems are seen across reading and listening. So someone who has difficulty with reading comprehension is very likely to also have difficulty with listening comprehension, with understanding spoken language. Problems with understanding can be related to difficulty in making the appropriate inferences, that is, contributing the correct information that is not stated in the text, but is required for the text to make sense. Problems with understanding may also be related to memory problems. So if someone does not remember what was stated in the text, it will be difficult to understand it because this information will need to be combined and retained and integrated in order for the situation model to be built. Therefore, problems with working memory will be especially relevant because in order to build the situation model, one needs to both retain and process information at the same time. So it's not just about memory for information. Access to knowledge will also limit understanding. For example, if someone doesn't know enough words or doesn't have enough background knowledge on the basis of which to understand the text. Metacognitive problems can also hinder understanding because if one doesn't have adequate monitoring of their ongoing understanding, they may not realize when they need to make an inference or whether their current situation model is adequate and coherent or in need of revision. Of all these possible sources of problem, the first one applies only to beginners and limits understanding as a secondary consequence. So if someone cannot recognize the words, then of course they will not be able to understand the passage, but that's not because they have understanding problems, they have problems getting to the words. So this is not a frank understanding problem and is typically resolved after the reading beginner stage. The remaining sources of difficulties are on aspects directly involved in the understanding process and underlie frank problems with reading comprehension.